Sarah Martinez had always believed in coincidences until the morning she found James collapsed on her kitchen floor. The paramedics said it was a sudden heart attack. He was only 32 years old, with no history of heart problems. They had spent the evening together, laughing over dinner and planning their weekend trip to the mountains. By sunrise, he was gone. The funeral was small and heartbreaking. James's mother held Sarah's hand tightly, whispering that at least her son had been happy in his final days. Sarah nodded numbly, unable to shake the image of finding him there, his coffee mug still warm on the counter, steam rising like his departing soul. 3 months passed before Sarah felt ready to date again. Her friends had been patient but persistent, reminding her that James would have wanted her to find happiness. When Marcus, a charming architect from her yoga class, asked her to dinner, she said yes. He had kind eyes and a gentle way of listening that made her feel understood. They talked until the restaurant closed, sharing stories about their childhoods and dreams for the future. Marcus walked her to her apartment door, and Sarah surprised herself by inviting him in for tea. They sat on her couch talking about everything and nothing until exhaustion overtook them both. Sarah offered him the guest room, and he gratefully accepted. She fell asleep that night feeling lighter than she had in months, hopeful that maybe she could love again. The screaming from the guest room woke her at dawn. Sarah rushed in to find Marcus convulsing violently, foam at his mouth. She dialed emergency services with shaking hands, but it was too late. The doctors said it was a rare allergic reaction, possibly to something he had eaten. They ran tests, searched for triggers, but found nothing conclusive. A healthy 28-year-old man had simply stopped breathing in his sleep. At Marcus's memorial service, Sarah sat in the back row, invisible in her grief and confusion. 2 men, both healthy, both gone the morning after spending the night, in her home. The coincidence felt impossible, yet undeniable. She began to wonder if she was cursed, if her touch brought death to those who came too close. Months turned into a year of self-imposed isolation. Sarah threw herself into her work as a librarian, finding comfort in the quiet company of books and the predictable routine of cataloging and shelving. She avoided social gatherings, declined invitations, and built walls around her heart that seemed impenetrable. Then David arrived. He was researching local history for a book he was writing about forgotten American towns. Every Tuesday and Thursday he would settle at the same table in the corner, surrounded by old newspapers and dusty records. Sarah found herself looking forward to his visits, to the way he would look up from his work and smile when she brought him requested materials. David had an infectious curiosity about the world. He would share fascinating stories from his research, bringing long-dead characters to life with his animated storytelling. Sarah discovered that she was laughing again, genuinely laughing for the first time since Marcus died. When David asked about her own story, she carefully edited out the recent tragedies, painting a picture of a quiet life devoted to books and learning. The friendship developed slowly, naturally. David would linger after the library closed, helping Sarah sort returns and sharing takeout dinners in the empty building. He never pushed for more, never made her feel pressured or uncomfortable. For the first time in over a year, Sarah felt like herself again. One evening, as they walked to their cars after a particularly late night of organizing a new shipment of historical documents, David mentioned that his apartment was being fumigated. He needed somewhere to stay for the night, and Sarah found herself offering her guest room before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air between them, and she almost took them back, almost made an excuse about not having clean sheets or expecting early morning calls. But David's grateful smile melted her resolve. How could she explain that she believed herself to be a harbinger of death? How could she tell this kind, brilliant man that every person who had slept in her home had died before the next sunset? It sounded insane, even to her own ears. She convinced herself that it had been a terrible coincidence, that 2 deaths did not make a pattern, that she was being ridiculous and superstitious. That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of David settling in the next room. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of sheets made her heart race. She found herself holding her breath, straining to hear evidence that he was still alive, still breathing. Several times, she almost got up to check on him, but fear kept her frozen in her bed. When dawn broke, Sarah crept to the guest room door and pressed her ear against it. Silence. Her blood turned to ice as she slowly turned the handle and pushed. The door opened. David lay perfectly still on his side, facing away from her. She called his name softly, then louder. No response. With trembling hands, she reached out to touch his shoulder and shake him gently. He was warm but motionless. She called his name again, her voice breaking with panic. Then, just as she was reaching for her phone to call for help, David stirred and rolled over, blinking sleepily at her. "Sarah? Is everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." The relief that flooded through her was so intense that she began to cry. David sat up, immediately concerned, pulling her into a comforting embrace. She sobbed against his chest, unable to explain her tears without sounding completely unhinged. He held her patiently, stroking her hair and murmuring reassurances until she finally calmed down. "Bad dreams," she managed to whisper, which was not entirely untrue. Her life had become a waking nightmare of anticipating tragedy. David made breakfast, while Sarah showered and tried to pull herself together. The normalcy of sharing coffee and scrambled eggs felt surreal after the terror of the early morning. As he prepared to leave for his research, David kissed her forehead gently and promised to call later. Sarah watched him walk to his car, alive and whole, and allowed herself to hope that maybe, finally, the pattern was broken. The phone call came 3 hours later. Sarah was in the middle of helping an elderly patron find a cookbook when her phone buzzed with David's number. She smiled, expecting to hear his voice telling her about some interesting discovery in the archives. Instead, a stranger's voice introduced himself as Dr. Peterson from City General Hospital. David had collapsed in the Historical Society's parking lot. A massive stroke, the doctor explained, completely unexpected in someone so young and healthy. He was in intensive care fighting for his life. Sarah's hands went numb and the phone clattered to the floor. The elderly patron steadied her as she swayed, asking if she needed to sit down. Sarah drove to the hospital in a daze, her mind racing between hope and despair. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe David would survive. Maybe the pattern wasn't as absolute as she had feared. She found his room and sat by his bedside, holding his hand and whispering apologies he couldn't hear. For 3 days, David lingered between life and death. Sarah barely left his side, surviving on hospital coffee and the kindness of nurses who brought her crackers and words of encouragement. On the 3rd morning, just as the sun was rising, David opened his eyes and squeezed her hand. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I dreamed about you." She burst into tears, this time from relief and gratitude. The doctors called it a miracle. Young stroke victims rarely recovered so completely or so quickly. Within a week, David was walking the hospital corridors, and within 2 weeks, he was released with a clean bill of health. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had been given a reprieve, not a pardon. David had come close to death, closer than anyone should at his age. The pattern had shifted, but not broken. She began to research everything she could about curses, supernatural phenomena, and unexplained deaths. The library's resources were extensive, and she dove into folklore, medical journals, and psychological studies with desperate determination. The more she read, the more convinced she became that something beyond coincidence was at work. Stories from around the world told of people who brought misfortune to their loved ones, of families cursed with tragic losses, of individuals who seemed to attract death like lightning rods attract storms. Some cultures called them death omens, others referred to them as cursed souls seeking redemption. Sarah also discovered cases of psychosomatic illness where extreme stress and guilt could manifest physical symptoms in both the sufferer and those around them. She wondered if her own terror and expectation of tragedy might somehow be influencing reality, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that put her loved ones in danger. David noticed her growing obsession with death and disaster. He would find her surrounded by books about unexplained phenomena, medical anomalies, and supernatural occurrences. When he asked about her research, she deflected, claiming she was helping a patron with a genealogy project involving mysterious family deaths. Their relationship deepened despite Sarah's internal turmoil. David was patient with her sudden mood swings and mysterious anxieties. When she would wake screaming from nightmares, he would hold her until she calmed down. When she would stare at him with inexplicable sadness, as if memorizing his face for the last time, he would gently ask what was troubling her. Sarah wanted desperately to tell him the truth, but how could she explain that she believed herself to be a walking curse? How could she say that every man who had stayed overnight in her home had died or nearly died? David was a rational man, a historian who dealt in facts and documentation. He would think she was having a breakdown, and maybe she was. Instead, she began subtly discouraging him from staying over. When he suggested spending the night, she would remember early morning appointments or claim she needed to catch up on work. When he offered to help with late library projects, she would insist she worked better alone. David was understanding but clearly puzzled by her sudden need for space. The strategy worked for several months. They would spend evenings together, share meals, go to movies and museums, but always part before bedtime. Sarah felt like she was living a half-life, keeping the person she loved at arm's length to protect him from whatever darkness surrounded her. Then David's apartment building was damaged in a gas leak explosion. No one was hurt, but the building was uninhabitable for at least a month while repairs were made. David's insurance would cover a hotel, but Sarah knew he was struggling financially while working on his book. The rational, caring part of her wanted to offer her guest room immediately. The terrified part of her wanted to run away and never see him again. The internal battle raged for days as David stayed in an expensive hotel and worried about his dwindling savings. Sarah made excuses about why he couldn't stay with her, each one sounding more hollow and hurtful. Finally, David confronted her directly. "Sarah, I don't understand what's happening between us. I thought we were building something real, something lasting. But every time I try to get closer, you pull away. If you don't want to be with me, just tell me honestly. Don't make me feel like I'm imposing or unwelcome." The pain in his voice broke her heart. She looked at this wonderful man who had brought joy and hope back into her life, and realized that her attempts to protect him were destroying their relationship anyway. If she was going to lose him, at least she could be honest about why, that night. Sarah told David everything. She started with James and Marcus, describing their sudden deaths and the terrible coincidence that had initially seemed impossible to believe. She told him about the months of isolation, the research into curses and supernatural phenomena, and her growing conviction that she was somehow responsible for bringing death to those she loved. David listened without interruption, his expression shifting from confusion to concern to something that looked like understanding. When she finished, they sat in silence for a long moment. Sarah prepared herself for him to leave, to write her off as unstable or delusional. Instead, David took her hands and said, "Sarah, I think you're suffering from survivor's guilt combined with anxiety disorder. What happened to James and Marcus was tragic, but it wasn't your fault. Coincidences, even terrible ones, do happen. You're not cursed, and you're not responsible for their deaths." Sarah wanted to believe David's rational explanation, but the fear had taken root too deeply in her soul. Even as he held her and promised that nothing would happen to him, She could see James's lifeless body on her kitchen floor and remember Marcus convulsing in the guest room. Two healthy men, both gone within hours of sleeping in her home. The statistics alone made it seem impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. David moved into her guest room the following week, despite Sarah's continued protests. He had sold his furniture before the building explosion, planning to buy new pieces after the repairs were complete. Staying with Sarah was the most practical solution, and he refused to let her fears dictate their lives. The first night was torture for Sarah. She lay awake listening to every sound from the next room, jumping at every creak and rustle. Around 3 a.m, she crept to his door and pressed her ear against it, straining to hear his breathing. When she heard nothing, panic seized her and she burst into the room, only to find David sitting up in bed reading by lamplight. "Can't sleep either?" he asked gently, patting the space beside him on the bed. "Come here." Sarah curled up next to him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. She felt safer with him awake, as if consciousness could somehow protect him from whatever force she believed was stalking her loved ones. They talked quietly until dawn, David sharing stories from his childhood and his dreams for the book he was writing. When morning came and David was still alive, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and continued dread. One night survived, didn't break the pattern. James had died after spending several evenings at her apartment. Marcus had survived 2 dinners before the fatal night. Maybe the curse needed time to build strength, like a storm gathering energy before striking. Days turned into weeks, and David remained healthy and vibrant. He established a routine of writing in the mornings, researching at various libraries and historical societies in the afternoons, and cooking dinner for Sarah when she came home from work. The domestic normalcy should have been comforting, but Sarah found herself watching him constantly for signs of illness or distress. She became hypervigilant about his health, insisting he see a doctor for routine checkups and screening tests. When he developed a minor cold, she panicked and wanted to take him to the emergency room. David was patient with her anxiety, but she could see the strain it was putting on their relationship. Her constant worry was exhausting them both. 3 months into their living arrangement, Sarah noticed that David had started researching something new. Instead of focusing on historical documents, he was reading medical journals and psychology textbooks. When she asked about the change in his research, he admitted that he had been looking into anxiety disorders, trauma responses, and the psychological impact of sudden loss. "I want to understand what you're going through," he explained. "I think if we can address the root cause of your fears, maybe you can start to heal." Sarah was touched by his dedication to helping her, but also frustrated by his refusal to consider that her fears might be based in reality. She had done her own research and found dozens of documented cases of people who seemed to bring misfortune to those around them. Throughout history, there were individuals who were avoided by their communities because death followed in their wake. The breakthrough came when David discovered a case study that seemed to match Sarah's situation exactly. In 1847, a woman named Mary Mallon had been investigated by authorities after several men in her town died mysteriously after visiting her home. Initially, the deaths were attributed to a curse or supernatural influence. However, further investigation revealed that Mary had been unknowingly poisoning her visitors with arsenic that was leaching from the wallpaper in her home. The wallpaper contained a popular green dye that was made with arsenic compounds. In humid conditions, the wallpaper would release toxic vapors that could cause sudden death in healthy individuals, especially those who slept in the affected rooms for extended periods. Once the wallpaper was removed, the mysterious deaths stopped immediately. David presented this case to Sarah with excitement, convinced that he had found a rational explanation for her situation. He suggested they have her apartment tested for toxic substances, gas leaks, or other environmental hazards that could cause sudden illness or death. Sarah was skeptical but agreed to the testing, partly because she hoped he was right and partly because she wanted to prove to him that the problem was beyond scientific explanation. The environmental testing revealed nothing unusual. No gas leaks, no toxic mold, no contaminated water, no dangerous chemicals. The apartment was clean and safe by all measurable standards. David was disappointed, but not defeated. He suggested they consult with a medical expert who specialized in unexplained deaths and environmental toxins. Dr. Rebecca Chen was a forensic pathologist who had investigated numerous cases of mysterious deaths. She reviewed the medical records of James and Marcus, studied the environmental test results, and interviewed both Sarah and David extensively. Her conclusion was that both deaths were genuinely unexplained medical events that, while rare, did occur in the general population. James had died from a condition called sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, where the heart stops beating due to an electrical malfunction with no underlying heart disease. Marcus had suffered from a rare allergic reaction called anaphylaxis, possibly triggered by a combination of factors including stress, fatigue, and an unknown allergen. Neither death was caused by environmental toxins or foul play. Dr. Chen explained that while the timing was certainly unusual, it was not impossible for such coincidences to occur. She estimated that the probability of both events happening to Sarah's partners was roughly 1 in several million, but not 0. She also noted that survivors' guilt and anxiety could create a heightened sense of pattern recognition, making Sarah more likely to attribute future medical events to the same mysterious cause. The human brain is wired to find patterns, even where none exist, Dr. Chen explained. After experiencing traumatic losses, it's natural to develop hypervigilance and to see connections that may not be there. This doesn't mean you're imagining things, or that your feelings aren't valid. It means you need help processing the trauma, so it doesn't continue to control your life. Sarah left the appointment feeling somewhat reassured but still troubled. The scientific explanations made sense intellectually, but emotionally she couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at work. David was more optimistic, convinced that understanding the medical facts would help Sarah overcome her fears. They began attending couples therapy sessions with a psychologist who specialized in trauma and relationship issues. Dr. Williams helped Sarah understand how her childhood experiences with loss and abandonment had primed her to interpret the deaths of James and Marcus as evidence of her own toxic influence. Her father had left when she was young. Her mother had died in a car accident when Sarah was in college, and her grandmother had passed away shortly after Sarah had moved in to care for her. The pattern of losing people she loved had created a deep-seated belief that she was somehow responsible for driving people away or bringing harm to them. The sudden deaths of 2 romantic partners had activated this existing fear and transformed it into a conviction that she was cursed or dangerous. Therapy sessions became a lifeline for Sarah, though the progress was slow and sometimes painful. Dr. Williams guided her through the process of examining her deepest fears and challenging the beliefs that had taken control of her life. Week by week, Sarah began to see how her traumatic experiences had created a distorted lens through which she viewed every relationship and loss. The breakthrough moment came during their 8th session when Dr. Williams asked Sarah to consider what would happen if David continued to live with her and remained healthy. Instead of feeling relieved at the prospect, Sarah felt a surge of panic. She realized that part of her was still waiting for tragedy to strike, and that his continued health felt almost threatening to her worldview. If David doesn't get sick or die, Sarah admitted tearfully, then I have to accept that James and Marcus died for random, meaningless reasons. I have to accept that sometimes terrible things just happen, and there's no one to blame, not even myself. That feels scarier than believing I'm cursed because at least a curse gives the death some kind of purpose or explanation. Dr. Williams nodded knowingly. Guilt can feel more comfortable than helplessness. If you're responsible for these tragedies, then you have some measure of control, even if it's the control to stay away from people you love. But accepting that you're not responsible means accepting that you can't protect the people you care about from every possible harm. This realization marked a turning point in Sarah's healing process. She began to understand that her fears were not really about being cursed or bringing death to others. They were about her terror of loving someone and losing them to circumstances beyond her control. The curse narrative had given her a reason to avoid intimate relationships and the vulnerability that comes with deep love. David had been incredibly patient throughout the therapy process, but Sarah could see the toll that her anxiety was taking on him. He had started having his own stress symptoms, including insomnia and headaches. Several times, Sarah caught him researching symptoms online, clearly worried that he might be developing whatever mysterious condition she feared would claim him. The irony was not lost on either of them. Sarah's fear of David dying was actually making him sick with stress and anxiety. Dr. Williams used this as an opportunity to show Sarah how her protective behaviors were having the opposite of their intended effect. By trying to guard against tragedy, she was creating the very problems she hoped to prevent. 6 months after David had moved in, Sarah made a decision that terrified her. She asked him to marry her. Not because she had overcome all her fears, but because she realized that fear was no way to live. If something happened to David, she would rather have loved him fully than spend their time together holding back and creating distance. David was surprised by the proposal, especially given Sarah's ongoing struggles with intimacy and trust. But he could see the courage it took for her to take such a step, and he said yes without hesitation. They planned a small ceremony for the following spring, giving Sarah time to continue working through her fears in therapy while also moving forward with their life together. The engagement period was both wonderful and challenging. Sarah still had episodes of panic, especially when David was late coming home or when he complained of minor aches and pains. But she was learning to recognize these moments as anxiety rather than premonitions, and David was learning to be patient with her process while also maintaining his own emotional boundaries. One night, about 8 months after David had moved in, Sarah woke from a nightmare to find his side of the bed empty. They had started sharing her bedroom a few months earlier, another step in Sarah's journey toward normal intimacy. Panic seized her as she called his name and got no response. She found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his laptop, working on his book. "I'm sorry," he said when he saw her frightened expression. "I couldn't sleep and didn't want to disturb you with the typing. I should have left a note." Sarah stood in the doorway watching him work and realized something had shifted. For the first time since James's death, her initial response to finding David missing from bed had not been the assumption that he was dead or dying. She had been worried and confused, but not immediately convinced that tragedy had struck. It was a small but significant progress. Dr. Williams helped Sarah recognize this moment as evidence of her healing. The neural pathways that had connected missing person with death were finally being rewired. Sarah was learning to consider multiple possibilities rather than jumping immediately to the worst-case scenario. As their wedding date approached, Sarah faced a new fear. What if the ceremony itself triggered something terrible? She had read about wedding day disasters, freak accidents, and sudden illnesses that struck during what should have been the happiest moments of people's lives. Dr. Williams helped her prepare for these anxieties by developing coping strategies and reality-checking techniques. The wedding was small and beautiful, held in the library where Sarah and David had first fallen in love. Surrounded by books and close friends, they exchanged vows that acknowledged both the joy and uncertainty of life. David promised to love Sarah through her fears and healing, while Sarah promised to love him despite her terror of loss. Their honeymoon was a test of Sarah's progress. They traveled to a remote cabin in the mountains, the same destination she had planned to visit with James before his death. Sarah had suggested the location partly as a way of reclaiming that lost dream, and partly as a challenge to herself to create new, positive associations with the place. The trip was largely successful, though Sarah still had moments of panic when David went hiking alone or when he slept more deeply than usual. But she was able to use her therapy tools to work through these episodes without letting them ruin their time together. More importantly, David remained healthy and happy throughout their stay. When they returned home, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed in her perspective. David had now lived with her for almost a year, sharing her space and her life in the most intimate ways possible. He had not only survived, but thrived. He was healthier and happier than when they first met, and their relationship had brought joy and stability to both of their lives. The pattern that had seemed so absolute and terrifying was definitively broken, not through magic or supernatural intervention, but through the hard work of therapy, the patience of a loving partner, and Sarah's own courage in choosing love over fear. She still had bad days and anxious moments, but they no longer defined her life or controlled her choices. Dr. Williams gradually reduced their therapy sessions from weekly to monthly to quarterly check-ins. Sarah had developed the tools she needed to manage her anxiety and trauma responses, and her relationship with David had become a source of strength rather than fear. They talked openly about her ongoing healing process, and David continued to support her without enabling her avoidance behaviors. 2 years after their wedding, Sarah faced an unexpected test of her healing when David developed a serious illness. He had been complaining of fatigue and joint pain for several weeks, symptoms that initially seemed like stress or overwork from finishing his book. But when he fainted at the library while researching his next project, Sarah knew something was seriously wrong. The diagnosis was rheumatoid arthritis, an autoimmune condition that would require ongoing treatment and lifestyle changes. When Dr. Martinez explained the condition and its potential complications, Sarah felt the familiar rush of terror and guilt. Her old thinking patterns tried to resurface. David was sick because of her, because he had stayed in her cursed presence for too long, because love in her life always led to suffering. But this time, Sarah recognized these thoughts as symptoms of her anxiety disorder rather than intuitive truth. She applied the cognitive techniques Dr. Williams had taught her, challenging each irrational belief with evidence and logic. David's condition was genetic and autoimmune, completely unrelated to their relationship or their living situation. Many people developed rheumatoid arthritis without any connection to death or tragedy. More importantly, David was not dying. He was facing a chronic illness that would require management, but with proper treatment, he could live a full and active life. This was not the same pattern as James and Marcus, who had died suddenly and unexpectedly. Sarah was learning to distinguish between illness and death, between manageable problems and insurmountable tragedies. David's diagnosis actually strengthened their relationship in unexpected ways. Sarah discovered that her years of anxiety and hypervigilance about health had given her knowledge and skills that proved useful in navigating the medical system. She became David's advocate, researching treatments, finding specialists, and helping him manage his symptoms. For the first time since James's death, Sarah felt like her protective instincts were serving a positive purpose. Instead of pushing David away to keep him safe, she was able to stay close and actually help keep him safe through practical support and emotional care. The transformation from feeling like a harbinger of death to becoming a source of healing and strength was profound. David's arthritis went into remission after 6 months of treatment, but the experience had taught them both valuable lessons about facing uncertainty together. Sarah realized that her fear of losing people she loved would never completely disappear, but it didn't have to control her choices or damage her relationships. Every couple faced the possibility of illness, accident, or loss, but most people managed to love deeply despite these risks. Around this same time, Sarah received news that James's mother, Mrs. Patterson, had requested to meet with her. They had not spoken since James's funeral 3 years earlier, and Sarah was terrified that the older woman blamed her for her son's death. Dr. Williams encouraged Sarah to accept the meeting as an opportunity to process her lingering guilt and perhaps find some closure. Mrs. Patterson was waiting in the library when Sarah arrived, sitting in the same corner where David used to do his research. She looked older and more fragile than Sarah remembered, but her eyes were kind and clear. She stood to embrace Sarah warmly, immediately putting her at ease. "I've been thinking about you for years," Mrs. Patterson said. "I know James loved you very much, and I could see how happy you made him in those last months. I wanted to thank you for that happiness and to make sure you weren't carrying any guilt about what happened." Sarah began to cry, finally able to voice the fears and self-blame she had carried for so long. Mrs. Patterson listened patiently as Sarah explained her belief that somehow her presence had caused James's death, and how that fear had nearly destroyed her ability to love again. "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Patterson said, taking Sarah's hands. "James had a heart condition that none of us knew about. The autopsy revealed a congenital defect that could have taken him at any time. If anything, knowing, you probably gave him more time because you made him so happy and motivated to take care of himself." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. James had died from an undiagnosed birth defect, not from some mysterious curse or toxic influence. His death had been a medical tragedy that no one could have predicted or prevented. All her guilt and fear had been based on incomplete information and trauma-distorted thinking. Mrs. Patterson went on to explain that she had not contacted Sarah earlier because she had needed time to process her own grief and because she had not realized that Sarah was blaming herself for James's death. When mutual friends mentioned Sarah's prolonged isolation and anxiety, Mrs. Patterson had felt compelled to reach out and provide the closure they both needed. The meeting was transformative for Sarah. For the first time since James's death, she felt genuine peace about what had happened to him. She was able to remember their relationship with joy rather than terror, to celebrate the love they had shared rather than focusing on its tragic ending. Most importantly, she finally understood that loving someone did not make her responsible for their fate. That evening, Sarah shared the conversation with David, who held her as she cried tears of relief and release. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and the pattern that had seemed so threatening and absolute was revealed to be a series of unrelated medical events that had nothing to do with Sarah's presence or influence. Dr. Williams was delighted by this breakthrough when Sarah shared it during their next appointment. She explained that many trauma survivors carry unnecessary guilt because they lack complete information about the events that caused their pain. Sarah's healing process had been complicated by not knowing the full medical circumstances of James's death, which had allowed her anxiety to fill in the gaps with worst-case explanations. With this final piece of understanding, Sarah was able to complete her healing journey. She no longer feared that loving someone would lead to their death, and she no longer needed to maintain emotional distance to keep people safe. The work of therapy had given her tools to manage anxiety and process trauma, but knowledge and time had provided the foundation for genuine peace. Sarah and David began talking about starting a family, a conversation that would have been impossible during the years when Sarah believed herself to be cursed. The idea of bringing children into their home, of creating new life in the space where she had once expected only death, felt like the ultimate victory over fear and trauma. They also decided to move into a larger home, leaving behind the apartment where so much pain and healing had taken place. Sarah felt ready for a fresh start, confident that she could carry the lessons she had learned into any environment without being controlled by superstition or fear. As they packed their belongings, Sarah found a box of items that had belonged to James and Marcus, things she had been too afraid to sort through in the years since their deaths. With David's support, she was finally able to go through these mementos with love rather than terror, keeping meaningful items and donating others. to charity. It was a final act of closure, honoring their memory while fully embracing her future. 5 years after David had first stayed in Sarah's guest room, they welcomed their daughter Emma into the world. Sarah held the tiny, perfect baby in her arms and felt a completeness she had never imagined possible during the dark years of her trauma. The nursery they had prepared was filled with love and hope instead of fear and superstition. Emma was a healthy, vibrant child who brought laughter and chaos into their peaceful home. Sarah discovered that motherhood presented new anxieties, but they were normal parental concerns rather than supernatural fears. She worried about sleep schedules and feeding patterns, about developmental milestones and playground safety, but she never once feared that her presence would bring harm to her daughter. David had completed his second book, a historical analysis of small American towns during the Industrial Revolution. The research that had brought him to Sarah's library had evolved into a comprehensive study that earned critical acclaim and established his reputation as a serious historian. He dedicated the book to Sarah, writing that she had taught him that the most important history was not found in dusty archives, but in the courage to build new stories from the ashes of old tragedies. Sarah had also made significant changes in her professional life. Inspired by her own healing journey, she had returned to school to earn a degree in counseling psychology. She wanted to help other people who had experienced trauma and loss, particularly those struggling with survivor's guilt and anxiety disorders. Her lived experience with these challenges, combined with formal training, made her exceptionally effective at connecting with clients who felt trapped by their fears. The library had been supportive of her career change, allowing her to work part-time while she completed her studies. When she graduated and opened her private practice, many of her former library patrons became her first clients. Word spread quickly about the librarian who had overcome her own trauma and was now helping others do the same. One of Sarah's most memorable clients was a young man named Robert who had survived a car accident that killed his best friend. Like Sarah, Robert believed that he was somehow cursed or responsible for bringing tragedy to people he cared about. He had isolated himself from friends and family, convinced that his presence endangered everyone around him. Working with Robert reminded Sarah of how far she had come. She could see her own former patterns of thinking reflected in his fears and self-blame. Using the same techniques that Dr. Williams had taught her, combined with her own insights from lived experience, Sarah was able to guide Robert through his healing process. Watching him gradually reconnect with his loved ones and rebuild his life was deeply fulfilling for Sarah. Dr. Williams had become a mentor and colleague as Sarah transitioned into the counseling field. She often referred clients to Sarah, particularly those dealing with trauma-related relationship issues. Dr. Williams noted that Sarah's unique combination of personal experience and professional training made her especially gifted at helping people who felt that their trauma made them fundamentally different or dangerous. Sarah's practice grew steadily, and she specialized in working with individuals who had experienced sudden losses or who had developed phobias related to intimacy and attachment. She also facilitated support groups for people dealing with various forms of survivor's guilt. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply meaningful, and Sarah felt that she had found her true calling. Emma thrived in this environment of healing and growth. At 3 years old, she was a confident, outgoing child who had never known a world where love was associated with danger or loss. Sarah sometimes marveled at her daughter's natural trust and openness, qualities that Sarah herself was still rebuilding. Emma's presence was a daily reminder that the patterns of fear and trauma did not have to be passed down to the next generation. The family had developed traditions that honored both healing and remembrance. Every year on the anniversary of James's death, Sarah would visit his grave and share memories of their time together with Emma and David. She spoke about James with love and gratitude rather than guilt and fear, teaching Emma that people we love become part of our story even after they are gone. They also celebrated what Sarah privately called her breakthrough anniversary, the day she had first told David about her fears and begun the journey toward healing. This date marked not the end of her struggles, but the beginning of her courage to face them honestly. The family would spend this day doing something special together, often visiting the library where Sarah and David had first fallen in love. Emma grew older. Sarah planned to share her story in age-appropriate ways, teaching her daughter about resilience, the importance of seeking help when struggling, and the difference between healthy caution and paralyzing fear. Sarah wanted Emma to understand that loving people always involved risk, but that the risk was worth taking because connection and intimacy were essential parts of a meaningful life. David's arthritis remained well controlled with medication and lifestyle modifications. The initial fear that his diagnosis had triggered in Sarah had evolved into a practical partnership in managing his health. They had learned to navigate medical challenges together without drama or catastrophic thinking. When David occasionally had flare-ups or needed to adjust his treatment, Sarah provided support without reverting to her old patterns of hypervigilance and panic. Their marriage had deepened and strengthened through all these experiences. They had learned to communicate openly about fears and concerns, to support each other through difficulties without losing their individual identities, and to maintain perspective about the normal challenges that every couple faces. The foundation of trust and understanding they had built during Sarah's healing process served them well in all aspects of their relationship. Sarah continued to have occasional moments of anxiety, particularly during times of stress or when faced with unexpected changes. But these episodes were brief and manageable, no longer capable of derailing her life or relationships. She had learned to recognize anxiety as a temporary emotional state rather than a source of reliable information about reality. The transformation from the terrified, isolated woman who had believed herself cursed to the confident, connected person she had become was complete but not forgotten. Sarah used her experience to help others and to maintain gratitude for the life she had built. She understood that healing was not a destination, but an ongoing process, and she remained committed to continued growth and self-awareness. In her practice, Sarah often shared a quote that had become meaningful to her during her own healing. "The pattern broke not when the circumstances changed, but when I changed my relationship to the circumstances." She had learned that she could not control whether tragedy would strike her loved ones, but she could control whether she would let fear of tragedy prevent her from loving them fully. The pattern that had once seemed so absolute and threatening had indeed been broken, not through magic or supernatural intervention, but through the patient work of healing, the support of loving relationships, and the courage to choose hope over fear. Sarah's story had transformed from one of curse and isolation to one of resilience and connection, proving that even the darkest patterns could be rewritten with time, effort, and love.